It was a bright Saturday morning in suburban Atlanta, the kind where the air feels fresh and full of possibility. FBI Special Agent Richard Thompson looked over at his daughter in the passenger seat, her fingers tapping away at her phone as they pulled up to the Riverside Mall. At 16, Maya had her father's confident smile and her mother's sharp intelligence, a combination that usually kept her out of trouble. "Got your phone charged?" Richard asked, falling into his usual safety checklist. Maya rolled her eyes good-naturedly, having heard this 100 times before. "Yes, Dad. And before you ask, yes, I have my wallet, and yes, I'll text you when I'm meeting my friends," she replied, adjusting her blue denim jacket. Her father's protective nature was both endearing and occasionally embarrassing, but she understood why. Being both a federal agent and a single dad had made him extra cautious. The mall's parking lot was starting to fill up with the usual weekend crowd. Through his windshield, Richard watched a group of elderly mall walkers doing their morning laps, while teenagers like his daughter began arriving in small groups, ready for a day of shopping and hanging out. "Remember, I'm just 3 minutes away at the field office if you need anything," he said, watching Maya gather her small backpack. It was the same field office where he built his reputation over 15 years, working his way up from a rookie agent to leading some of the most sensitive cases in the Southeast region. Maya leaned over and gave him a quick peck on the cheek. "Dad, I'm meeting Olivia and Ashley right at the food court. We're just going to get smoothies and maybe look for some stuff for the school dance. Nothing crazy." Richard couldn't help but smile. It seemed like yesterday he was teaching her to ride a bike, and now here she was, growing into a confident young woman. He watched as she stepped out of the car, her curly hair bouncing as she walked. She'd inherited her mother's graceful way of moving, a thought that brought both warmth and a familiar pang of loss. Through the rearview mirror, he saw her wave to her friends who were waiting by the mall entrance. Olivia's bright yellow sweater stood out against the brick building, while Ashley was doing her usual animated talking, probably about the latest TikTok trend. They were good kids from good families. He'd made sure to get to know them and their parents over the years. As Maya disappeared through the glass doors with her friends, Richard sat for a moment longer than usual. Something felt different about today, though he couldn't put his finger on it. Maybe it was just the way the morning light hit the buildings, or perhaps it was his investigator's instinct picking up on something he hadn't consciously processed yet. He shook off the feeling and started the car, mentally preparing for the stack of paperwork waiting at his desk. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend at the office, just catching up on reports and maybe grabbing lunch with his partner to discuss their ongoing cases. Little did he know that in less than an hour, his quiet Saturday would turn into one of the most intense days of his career, and his daughter would find herself at the center of an incident that would shake their community to its core. Richard pulled out of the parking lot, his government-issued vehicle merging smoothly into weekend traffic. As he drove the familiar route to the field office, he had no way of knowing that his next visit to this mall wouldn't be for shopping, it would be for justice. The morning sun continued to climb higher, casting long shadows across the parking lot as more cars arrived. Inside the mall, Maya and her friends joined the growing weekend crowd, their laughter mixing with the ambient music and general chatter of shoppers. It was just another Saturday at Riverside Mall, at least for the next few minutes. Inside the bustling Riverside Mall, Officer William Peters stood near the central fountain, his eyes constantly scanning the crowds. He'd been with the local police department for 12 years, and lately his record had raised some eyebrows among his supervisors. There had been complaints, too many to ignore, but nothing had ever stuck. The morning crowd moved around him like a flowing river. Families with shopping bags, elderly couples window shopping, and groups of teenagers enjoying their weekend freedom. But Peters wasn't watching them all equally. His attention kept drifting to certain faces, certain groups, a bias he'd never admitted to himself. He noticed Maya and her friends coming out of the smoothie shop, their cups still full and cold. The three girls were laughing about something on Olivia's phone, completely carefree and unaware of the attention they were drawing. Peters straightened up, his hand unconsciously touching his belt as he watched them enter the department store. "They're probably just shopping," his partner, Officer Chen, said quietly beside him. Chen was newer to the force and had been paired with Peters for training. But lately, he'd started questioning some of his senior partner's instincts. "You're too soft," Peters muttered, already moving toward the store entrance. I've been doing this long enough to know when something's not right. Chen followed reluctantly, knowing what was likely coming next. Inside the store, Maya and her friends were doing exactly what they told her dad they would do, looking at dresses for the upcoming school dance. They held up different options, took pictures, and did all the normal things teenage girls do while shopping. The store's security cameras would later confirm every innocent moment. But Peters wasn't interested in what the cameras would show. He'd already made up his mind about what he was seeing. When Maya separated from her friends to look at a rack of shoes, he made his move, purposefully ignoring the receipt sticking out of her shopping bag from another store. Chen watched uncomfortably as his partner positioned himself near the store's exit, his body language tense and ready. The other shoppers sensed it too, the shift in atmosphere that comes when authority takes an unhealthy interest in innocence. Maybe we should check the other stores, Chen suggested, trying to redirect his partner's attention. There was that report about shoplifting near the electronics store. But Peters wasn't listening. His focus had narrowed to a tunnel, and at the end of that tunnel was a 16-year-old girl whose only crime was shopping while black. He didn't see a straight-A student who volunteered at the local animal shelter. He didn't see an FBI agent's daughter who had grown up understanding both law enforcement and justice. He saw what his prejudices wanted him to see. The store's regular customers began to notice. An elderly woman clutched her purse tighter, but her eyes weren't on the teenagers, they were on the officer who seemed to be stalking them. A young mother pulled her children closer, already reaching for her phone, recognizing a situation that was about to go very wrong. Maya and her friends reunited near the jewelry counter, holding up their finds and chatting about prices. They noticed Officer Peters too. It was hard not to. But they'd been raised to stay calm around law enforcement, to know their rights while being respectful. They did everything right, everything their parents had taught them. As the girls headed toward the exit, Peters shifted his weight, ready to move. Chen made one last attempt to stop what was coming. William, they're just kids shopping. Let's. But his words were cut off by Peters' sharp movement forward. The next few moments would be captured by dozens of phones, shared thousands of times, and eventually become part of a much larger conversation about power, prejudice, and justice in America. Behind his desk at the FBI field office, Richard Thompson was just opening his first case file of the day, unaware that his phone was about to ring with a call that would change everything. In just moments, a father's worst fears and an agent's deepest commitment to justice would collide in a way that would shake an entire department to its core. The mall's security cameras kept rolling, indifferent witnesses to what was about to unfold. The morning light streamed through the high windows, casting long shadows that seemed to point toward an unavoidable confrontation. The stage was set, and there was no turning back. Everything happened in a flash. Officer Peters stepped directly into Maya's path as she and her friends approached the store exit. "Stop right there," he commanded, his voice carrying across the now quiet store. Shoppers froze, phones started recording, and Maya felt her heart skip a beat. "Is there a problem, officer?" Maya asked calmly, just as her father had taught her. She kept her hands visible, her movements slow and deliberate. Her friends stood close, their shopping bags clutched tight, their smoothies forgotten and melting. "Empty your bags," Peters demanded, ignoring the store's security guard who was approaching with a concerned look. "We've had reports of shoplifting, and you fit the description." Maya's friend Olivia spoke up, her voice shaking slightly. "We have receipts for everything. We didn't take anything." She started reaching for her bag to show the proof, but Peters held up his hand sharply. "I wasn't talking to you," he snapped, eyes fixed on Maya. "Show me what's in your bags. Now." The growing crowd of onlookers murmured disapprovingly. A middle-aged woman stepped forward, speaking firmly. "I've been shopping near these girls for the past 20 minutes. They haven't done anything wrong." Officer Chen shifted uncomfortably behind his partner. "William, they have receipts. Maybe we should." "Stay out of this," Peters cut him off. He reached for Maya's shopping bag, but she held onto it, standing her ground. "Sir, I have receipts for everything," Maya said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I know my rights. You need probable cause to search my belongings, and shopping while black isn't probable cause." Peters' face darkened at her words. "You want to play lawyer? Fine. Put your hands behind your back. You're being detained for questioning." The store manager finally pushed through the crowd, waving a tablet. "Officer, I have the security footage right here. These girls haven't done anything wrong. They've been model customers." But Peters wasn't listening. He reached for his handcuffs while calling for backup on his radio, painting a picture of an uncooperative suspect that bore no resemblance to the calm teenage girl standing before him. Maya's friends had their phones out now, along with dozens of other witnesses. The store's security guard was on his radio too, but he was calling mall management, his face showing clear disapproval of the officer's actions. "I'm calling my father," Maya announced clearly, reaching slowly for her phone. "He's an FBI agent at the local field office. I want him present for any questioning." Peters laughed dismissively. "Yeah, and I'm the tooth fairy. Hands behind your back now." As Peters moved to handcuff her, Maya stayed perfectly still, her phone already dialing. She'd been taught what to do in situations like this, but knowing what to do and experiencing it were very different things. The crowd had grown larger, their phones recording every moment. Someone had gone live on social media, and the views were climbing rapidly. Officer Chen had stepped back, his face showing clear distress at his partner's actions. "This is wrong." A young man in the crowd called out. "She's just a kid shopping with her friends." The store manager was still trying to intervene, holding up the security footage. "Officer, please look at this. There's been no crime committed here." But Peters was too far gone, too invested in his mistaken assumptions. He roughly grabbed Maya's wrist, ignoring her wincing as the handcuffs clicked into place. Through it all, Maya's phone had connected to her father's number. It lay on the ground now, on speaker, capturing every word, every sound. And Richard Thompson heard it all: the click of the handcuffs, the protests of the crowd, and most importantly, his daughter's voice, strong but frightened. "Dad, I need you." The next 3 minutes would feel like an eternity to everyone involved. But for Officer William Peters, they would be the last 3 minutes of his career as he knew it. He just didn't know it yet. Through the mall's broad windows, the mid-morning sun cast harsh shadows across the scene, highlighting the injustice unfolding in stark relief. And somewhere in the distance, the sound of rapidly approaching footsteps echoed through the mall corridors, the sound of a father rushing to protect his child, and an FBI agent coming to uphold the law he had sworn to defend. The sound of his daughter's voice through the phone speaker made Richard Thompson's blood run cold. He was already moving before his mind fully processed what was happening, his chair spinning empty behind his desk. His partner looked up in alarm as he grabbed his jacket, his FBI credentials already in hand. "Maya, stay calm." "I'm on my way," he spoke clearly into the phone as he ran down the hallway. Other agents turned to watch as he passed, recognizing the urgency in his stride. "Keep the line open." "I'm 3 minutes out." Through the phone, he could hear everything: the murmur of the angry crowd, Officer Peters' harsh commands, and his daughter's steady breathing as she fought to stay composed. Richard's heart swelled with pride, even as rage threatened to overwhelm him. She was handling this exactly as he taught her. "Sir, you're hurting me." Maya's voice came through, still calm but tight with pain. The handcuffs were too tight, cutting into her wrists. "Stop resisting then," Peter's voice barked back, though witnesses would later testify that Maya hadn't resisted at all. Richard burst through the field office doors, running to his car. His mind was racing, but his training kept him focused. He hit the lights but not the siren, no need to cause panic in the mall. The 3-minute drive had never felt longer. "Officer, her father really is FBI," he heard Olivia trying to explain through the phone. "Just wait a few minutes." "I'm tired of your lies," Peters cut her off. "Everyone's got some kind of excuse." Richard's car screeched into the mall parking lot. He could hear mall security trying to reason with Peters now, their voices joining the chorus of concerned witnesses. His daughter's friends were still recording everything, their hands shaking but cameras steady. As he ran through the mall entrance, Richard forced himself to slow down. Running through a crowded mall with a visible firearm, even with FBI credentials, could cause panic. He moved quickly but controlled, his badge already out. "That's enough." Peter's voice came through the phone, followed by the sound of Maya gasping in pain. "You're all interfering with a police investigation." Richard rounded the last corner, and finally he could see them. His daughter, handcuffed and trying not to show fear. The rogue officer, red-faced and aggressive. The crowd of witnesses, phones raised like shields against injustice. Officer Chen, looking like he wished the ground would swallow him whole. FBI. Richard's voice boomed across the space, causing Peters to spin around. Take those cuffs off my daughter, now. The change in Peters' face would have been comical under different circumstances. The color drained from his cheeks as Richard approached, badge held high, every inch the federal agent. This is your last warning, Richard continued, his voice deadly calm. Release my daughter, or the civil rights violations you're already facing will be the least of your concerns. Mall security moved closer, ready to help if needed. The store manager stepped forward with his tablet, security footage queued up. Officer Chen finally found his courage and moved to unlock Maya's handcuffs himself, ignoring his partner's stunned expression. As the cuffs came off, Richard saw the red marks on his daughter's wrists, and his jaw tightened. But his voice remained professional as he spoke into his phone. This is Special Agent Thompson. I need a supervisor from the local PD at the Riverside Mall, main entrance of Kingston Department Store. And get me someone from Internal Affairs. Maya rubbed her wrists but held her head high. The crowd was still recording, but now they were watching something else. Justice in action, systematic and by the book. This wasn't about revenge, it was about accountability. Peters finally found his voice. I was just doing my job. Your job? Richard cut him off, his voice sharp enough to make the officer step back. Your job is to protect and serve. Tell me, who were you protecting when you profiled and handcuffed an innocent teenage girl? Who were you serving when you ignored multiple witnesses and evidence of her innocence? Through the mall's windows, red and blue lights began flashing as local police supervisors arrived. The next few hours would change everything, not just for Officer Peters, but for the entire department. And it all started with a phone call, a father's love, and 3 minutes that felt like forever. The atmosphere in the mall shifted dramatically as Richard Thompson took control of the situation. His FBI credentials caught the fluorescent lighting, but it was his presence, calm, authoritative, and unmistakably powerful, that commanded attention. First things first, Richard said, pulling out his phone again. I want every piece of security footage from the last hour secured. All cameras, all angles. The store manager nodded quickly, already tapping on his tablet. And I want statements from every witness who's willing to provide one. Peters stood frozen, his face a mixture of shock and growing dread. The crowd that had gathered was still recording, their phones capturing every moment of his downfall. Some were already uploading their videos, and social media was about to explode. Sir, Officer Chen stepped forward, his voice steady for the first time that day. I want to provide a statement too. What I witnessed here, it wasn't right. His partner shot him a look of betrayal, but Chen stood his ground. The mall's security chief arrived, slightly out of breath. Agent Thompson, we've already secured all the footage. And our officers reported Officer Peters has had similar incidents before. We just never had enough evidence to prove it. You do now, Richard replied, watching as Maya's friends hugged her. She was staying strong, but he could see the slight tremor in her hands. His daughter was tough, but she was still just 16, and this should never have happened to her. Local police supervisors burst through the store entrance, led by Captain Rodriguez. Her face was thunder as she took in the scene. Officer Peters, she barked, badge and gun. Now. Captain, you don't understand, Peters started, but Rodriguez cut him off. Oh, I understand perfectly. We've had complaints about you before, but now we have proof. And not just any proof. You managed to harass a federal agent's daughter while being recorded by dozens of witnesses. Your career couldn't be more over if you tried. As Peters reluctantly handed over his badge and gun, the mall's customer service office was being transformed into a temporary command center. Witnesses lined up to give statements, their phones ready to share videos and photos. The security footage is clear, the store manager announced, showing his tablet to Captain Rodriguez and Agent Thompson. These girls did absolutely nothing wrong. They browsed, they tried things on, they checked prices, normal teenage shopping. Richard watched the footage, his jaw tightening as he saw Peters following the girls, ignoring other shoppers, clearly profiling based on race. I want every second of this footage preserved, he said, And I want access to footage from the past 6 months. We're going to review every interaction Officer Peters has had in this mall. The local news had arrived, drawn by the social media buzz. They stationed themselves outside, their cameras capturing the steady stream of witnesses leaving the store. Each person had a story to tell about what they'd seen, about the injustice they'd witnessed, about how an ordinary shopping trip had turned into a moment of reckoning. Maya sat with her friends, giving her own statement to a female officer. Her voice was clear and precise as she recounted every detail. He didn't ask for receipts, she explained. He didn't check the security cameras. He didn't even tell me what I'd supposedly stolen. He just assumed. Richard overheard her statement, and pride mixed with pain in his chest. His daughter shouldn't have to be this strong, this composed, in the face of such blatant prejudice. But she was handling it with a grace that made him both proud and angry, proud of her strength, angry that she had to use it. Agent Thompson, Captain Rodriguez approached him, her face serious. This isn't just about today. With your daughter's case as a catalyst, we can finally investigate every complaint filed against Peters. We can make real changes in the department. Richard nodded, watching as Peters sat alone on a bench, his former partner giving a statement that would help end his career. The morning light streamed through the mall's skylights, illuminating a scene of justice in progress. Not swift justice, not violent justice, but the kind of justice that changes systems from within. The temporary command center buzzed with activity as Richard Thompson systematically dismantled Officer Peters' false allegations. The store's bright lights illuminated a scene that was part investigation, part revolution, a moment when years of unchecked bias finally met its match. Let's go through this step by step, Richard said, spreading out the evidence on a makeshift table. The store's security footage played on multiple screens, showing different angles of the incident. You claimed you had reports of shoplifting. Peters shifted uncomfortably in his chair. There were suspicious activities reported. Really? Captain Rodriguez cut in, flipping through the day's reports. Because there's no record of any shoplifting calls today. Not one. She laid the report log in front of Peters, whose face reddened. The store manager stepped forward with more evidence. Here's the complete footage of the girls' shopping trip. They entered at 10:15 a.m., went to the dress section at 10:20, tried on clothes at 10:35, and were approached by Officer Peters at 10:45. At no point did they do anything suspicious. On the screens, the footage showed Maya and her friends doing exactly what teenage girls do at the mall, laughing, shopping, taking selfies with potential outfits. The contrast between the innocent reality and Peters' aggressive response was stark. And here are their receipts, Richard continued, laying out each piece of paper. Time-stamped, detailed, and complete. Every item in their bags is accounted for. He turned to Peters, his voice level but intense. So tell me, officer, what exactly was your probable cause? Peters remained silent, his earlier confidence completely deflated. Around him, the evidence of his prejudice mounted. Witness statements described his aggressive behavior, security footage showed his targeted following of the girls, and his own body camera footage, which he had failed to turn off, captured his dismissive remarks about their protests of innocence. Outside the command center, the mall had become a hub of activity. Local news crews interviewed witnesses, their cameras capturing the story of how a routine shopping trip exposed years of systematic bias. Social media was exploding with video clips, each one adding to the growing narrative of injustice confronted and overcome. Maya sat with a counselor provided by the mall, her friends still by her side. She was helping other young people who came forward, sharing similar stories about encounters with Officer Peters. Her trauma was becoming a catalyst for change. It wasn't just today. One young woman told the investigators, her voice shaking. He's been doing this for months. We didn't think anyone would believe us. Richard watched as each new statement added another nail to the coffin of Peters' career. But this wasn't about destroying one officer, it was about fixing a broken system. Captain, he addressed Rodriguez, we need to review every complaint filed against Officer Peters. Every incident report, every call log, every piece of footage. This stops today, but we also need to make sure it never happens again. The captain nodded grimly. Already on it. And not just Peters, we're reviewing the whole department's approach to community policing. This incident, it's opened a lot of eyes. Officer Chen approached with more files. Sir, I've documented other incidents I witnessed. Times when I should have spoken up but didn't. I know it's too late, but maybe it can help make things right. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the mall's windows, but unlike the morning's darkness, these shadows couldn't hide the truth. On the security monitors, the footage played on loop. A clear record of prejudice in action and of justice finally being served. Dad, Maya called softly from the doorway. Richard looked up, seeing not just his daughter, but a symbol of every young person who'd ever faced unfair treatment. The other kids, they want to know what happens next. How do we make sure this really changes things? Richard stood, facing the room full of evidence, witnesses, and officials. We document everything. We make it impossible to ignore. And we make sure that next time someone says this happened to me, they're not just believed, they're protected. The arrival of Officer Peters' supervisor turned the already tense situation into something even more significant. Deputy Chief Harrison walked into the makeshift command center, his face grim as he surveyed the scene. He'd been called away from his daughter's soccer game for this, and the growing media presence outside told him this wasn't just another incident. Well, he said, looking at the wall of evidence before him, seems like you've finally crossed a line you can't uncross, Peters. His eyes moved from the security footage to the pile of witness statements, then to Maya's documented wrist injuries from the too tight handcuffs. Richard Thompson stepped forward, his FBI credentials catching the fluorescent light. Deputy Chief, I'm not just here as a concerned father. My task force specializes in investigating civil rights violations within law enforcement. What happened today? It's just the tip of the iceberg. The color drained from Harrison's face. The FBI's Civil Rights Task Force was every police department's worst nightmare. They had the power to investigate not just individual officers, but entire systems of behavior and policy. We've found 17 similar complaints against Officer Peters in the past year alone, Captain Rodriguez reported, spreading out the files. All involving young minorities, all dismissed due to lack of evidence. But now? Now we have everything on camera, Harrison finished, rubbing his forehead. From multiple angles, with dozens of witnesses. Peters sat in the corner, his empty holster a stark reminder of his suspended status. His previous swagger had completely vanished, replaced by a nervous twitch as he watched his career crumble around him. Outside the command center, the story was growing. News vans lined the mall parking lot, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like metal trees. Social media was ablaze with hashtags and video clips, each one adding to the pressure for change. Sir, a young officer interrupted, tablet in hand, we've got something else. The mall's security team just sent over footage from the past 6 months. They've identified at least 12 other incidents involving Officer Peters. Harrison's face darkened as he watched the compiled footage. Each clip showed the same pattern. Peters targeting young minorities, making aggressive stops without cause, ignoring evidence of innocence. This isn't just about one bad officer anymore, Richard said quietly. This is about a system that let him operate unchecked for years. How many complaints were ignored? How many kids were traumatized? How many times did someone try to speak up only to be silenced? Maya's voice carried from where she sat with other young people who'd come forward with their stories. She was helping them write their statements, her own experience still fresh, but already turning into something powerful, a catalyst for change. The thing is, she was saying to a younger girl who was shaking as she wrote, they count on our silence. They think we'll be too scared or too embarrassed to speak up. But not anymore. Deputy Chief Harrison watched the scene unfold, his law enforcement experience warring with his humanity. Agent Thompson, he said finally, your task force, what exactly will they be looking for? Everything, Richard replied simply. Training procedures, complaint processes, disciplinary records. We'll review every traffic stop, every arrest, every interaction. This department needs more than just one officer removed. It needs a complete overhaul. The weight of those words settled over the room. Officers who had gathered to watch shifted uncomfortably, some recognizing their own potential complicity in a broken system. Officer Chen, still providing evidence against his former partner, looked up from his statement. We need this, he said, his voice carrying in the quiet room. We all knew something was wrong, but we looked the other way. We can't do that anymore. Deputy Chief Harrison nodded slowly, his decision made. Captain Rodriguez, I want every officer's body camera footage reviewed for the past year. Every complaint gets reinvestigated, no matter how small. And get me the training officers. Our whole approach needs to change. Outside, the afternoon sun had begun its descent, casting long shadows across the mall parking lot. But inside, light was finally being shed on dark corners that had been ignored for too long. This wasn't just about one officer's mistake anymore. It was about transforming an entire system, one truth at a time. Richard Thompson stood at the front of a packed community center 3 weeks after the mall incident. Behind him, a large screen showed footage from that day, alongside statistics and data that told a larger story. The room was filled with community members, police officers, local officials, and most importantly, young people who'd finally found their voice. What happened to my daughter wasn't unique, he began, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. What was unique was that it was caught on camera, and that I had the power to do something about it. But every person in this room deserves that same power. Maya sat in the front row with her friends and other young people who'd come forward with their stories. The red marks on her wrists had faded, but the determination in her eyes had only grown stronger. She'd spent the past weeks helping organize this community meeting, turning her trauma into action. Since that Saturday morning, Captain Rodriguez reported, standing beside Richard, we've uncovered over 50 similar incidents. Officer Peters wasn't just one bad apple, he was a symptom of a larger problem. And today, we're here to talk about solutions. The screen behind them switched to show the department's new initiatives: mandatory bias training, community oversight committees, revised complaint procedures, and body camera policies with real accountability measures. But policies aren't enough, Deputy Chief Harrison added, his uniform crisp but his manner humbled. We need to change the culture. That's why we're here, to listen to you, to learn from you, to do better. One by one, people stood to share their stories. A grandmother talked about her grandson being stopped 3 times in 1 week. A college student described being followed through stores. A young boy spoke about being afraid to walk home from school. Maya stood up next, her voice clear and strong. What happened to me was scary, she admitted. But what scares me more is thinking about all the people who didn't have an FBI agent for a father, who didn't have dozens of witnesses with phones, who didn't have the power to fight back. The room fell silent as security footage from the mall played again. But this time, it was followed by clips of positive changes. Officers attending community events, youth program launches, new training sessions in progress. Officer Peters has been terminated, Captain Rodriguez announced, though most people already knew. But more importantly, we've implemented new screening procedures for all officers. We're reviewing past complaints, and we've created a civilian oversight board with real power. Richard watched as hands shot up around the room, not in anger now, but with questions, suggestions, ideas for building bridges between the police and the community they served. A young officer who'd graduated from the academy just months ago stood up. I joined to make a difference, she said, her voice shaking slightly. But I need to know how to do that right. I need to know how to serve everyone equally. The meeting stretched into the evening, but no one left. They were all part of something bigger now. A real chance for change, sparked by one incident, but fueled by years of unheard voices finally finding their platform. As the sun set outside, casting an orange glow through the community center's windows, Richard looked at his daughter. She was surrounded by other young people, helping them fill out applications for the new Youth Advisory Council they'd created. This doesn't end here, he told the crowd as the meeting drew to a close. This is just the beginning. Real change takes time, commitment, and most importantly, it takes all of us working together. The room buzzed with energy as people exchanged contact information, signed up for committees, and made plans for future meetings. What had started as a response to injustice was becoming a movement for lasting change. Maya caught her father's eye and smiled, not the smile of someone who'd been victimized, but of someone who'd found her purpose. Sometimes, the worst moments in our lives become the catalyst for the most important changes. And in a suburban community center, on a warm evening 3 weeks after a terrible morning at the mall, that change was finally beginning to take root. 3 months after that fateful Saturday morning at the mall, the changes in the community were impossible to ignore. The local police department had undergone a complete transformation, not just in policy, but in spirit. The story that began with one officer's prejudice had sparked a revolution in how law enforcement engaged with the community. Maya stood at the podium in the city council chambers, her voice steady as she addressed the packed room. She'd grown in these months, turning her experience into a powerful force for change. Behind her sat her father, Richard, alongside Captain Rodriguez and Deputy Chief Harrison. "When I was handcuffed that day," she began, "I felt helpless. But looking back now, that moment wasn't about helplessness, it was about hope. Hope that we could turn something painful into something powerful." The statistics displayed on the wall told a compelling story. Complaints against officers had dropped by 60%. Community engagement was at an all-time high. The new Civilian Oversight Board, which Maya helped establish, had reviewed over 200 past cases and implemented sweeping reforms. Officer Chen, now promoted to community liaison, shared the department's progress. "We've retrained every officer," he reported. "But more importantly, we've changed how we think about our role. We're not just enforcing laws, we're building trust." The former mall security footage played one last time, but now it was followed by new images. Officers attending neighborhood cookouts, youth mentorship programs in action, community meetings where real dialogue happened. The contrast was striking. A young teenager raised her hand during the question period. "I used to be scared when I saw police cars in my neighborhood," she said. "Now I know most of the officers by name. They come to our basketball games. They help with our homework program. They're part of our community." Richard watched his daughter field questions with grace and wisdom beyond her years. The task force's investigation had led to more than just Officer Peters' dismissal. It had uncovered systemic issues in departments across the state. Now, the community's reforms were becoming a model for others. "But we're not done," Maya reminded everyone. "Change isn't a destination, it's a journey. We have to keep working, keep listening, keep growing together." The Youth Advisory Council, which started with just a few brave voices, now had over 50 active members. They worked directly with police leadership, ensuring that young perspectives were heard and respected. Captain Rodriguez shared the latest initiative, a comprehensive training program developed with community input. "Our officers now spend as much time learning about cultural awareness and communication as they do about tactical procedures," she explained. "Because the best way to protect and serve is to understand and connect." As the meeting drew to a close, Richard noticed something remarkable. The room wasn't divided between community members and police officers anymore. People mingled freely, sharing stories, making plans, building the kind of relationships that prevent incidents like Maya's from happening in the first place. Outside, the evening sun painted the sky in shades of hope. Maya hugged her friends from the youth council, their laughter echoing across the parking lot. They weren't just teenagers anymore. They were leaders, change makers, proof that one moment of injustice could spark a lifetime of positive change. "Dad," Maya called, waving him over to meet some new council members. "We're planning a workshop for next month. Would you help us?" Richard smiled, seeing in his daughter's eyes the same determination that had driven him throughout his career. "Of course," he said. "This is what real justice looks like, not just responding to wrongs, but working together to make things right." As they walked to their car, the city council building behind them hummed with continued discussion and planning. The story that began with handcuffs and prejudice had transformed into something beautiful, a community united, a system reformed, and a future bright with possibility. And somewhere in that future, a young person would feel safer, an officer would make a better choice, and a community would be stronger. All because one Saturday morning at the mall became the catalyst for real, lasting change.